I'm very pleased to introduce Stéphane Jettot, who many of you will know. He's been come to a few of our seminars before. He's an assistant professor at the Sorbonne and currently has a 2-year sabbatical in Oxford at the Maison Française. And his current research project is on the creation and management of family archives in the Long 18th Century. And so today, he's going to be talking to us about this project, and his paper is titled Identity and Genealogical Knowledge in the 18th Century.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you for your kind invitation to present this work. And I must apologize in advance for my Gallic accent. I hope it won't be too traumatizing for your ears. Anyway, and of course, this is very much a work in progress, so I would be grateful for any comments and especially criticism. So broadly speaking, my research deals with family archive practices over a long 18th century, and this work was shaped by the works of social historians who had already recognized the importance of language, gender and culture in the establishment of social hierarchies. In particular, this 18th century seminar has offered a very stimulating environment to test these ideas with the support of many sources which for long were overlooked in preference for factual data, such as acres, incomes, and so on. To mention but a few examples, I'm thinking of the influential works on prescriptive literature, social terminology and classification, for example, on the urban and professional directories, which have been recently studied by Penny, or on polite journals such as made by Gillian Williamson on the Gentleman magazine. By the same token, family records, diaries, correspondence, previously assigned to the private sphere, are now used to shed light on the strength of kinship, which either convert or enable the crossing of social boundaries, as could be seen in baptism practices, mercantile and cultural activities. So genealogical records could also be useful. Basically, any documents in the family archives could be used in the making of a genealogy, a manuscript, a book, an object, a painting, and so on. Diaries, account books, or correspondence abound with small genealogical digressions. They help us to understand why someone would start to grow an interest in or her family past. For example, Naomi Tenmore described how the shopkeeper Thomas Turner did not mention in his diary any interest in family lineage, but then later in his life, when he became a property owner and a father of his own right, he suddenly grew, quote, a sense of patrilineal descent. These digressions are often linked to a specific situation, be the need to defend one's social status, but it could also be a way to express solidarity, affection between siblings, or it could be linked to a legal procedure or fit into a political or polite interest. Or even famously in Thomas Hardy's Test of the D'Urberville, genealogy became the instrument of a modern tragedy, with the fatal encounter between the old John Duberfield and the parson Tringham, who revealed his prestigious pedigree. But genealogical sources lend themselves to be studied in a more systematic or even a quantitative way, when especially they are produced by an external event, which could be an institutional inquiry, formal inquest by the Council of Venice, for example, the Spanish Inquisition, les enquêtes de noblesse in the French monarchy, or the English College of Arms. And we have excellent research on the gathering and selecting of documents by the families under the pressure of these institutions. An effort which was sometimes done in a state of panic and with dramatic consequences. I'm thinking, of course, of the neo-Christian in Spain from Jewish or more descent. These archival practices could be also the consequence of commercial undertakings, which flourished from the late 17th century onwards, and which were mostly financed by subscription. In France, for example, there's something wrong. In France, for example, the Généalogiste du Roi started to sell a printed result of their inquiry called a nobiliaire. In Germany, Volker Bauer described the first publications of the Universal Genealogy, which were directed to a larger non-court audience. And in England, it seems that the end of the visitation after 1685 gave way to various commercial projects from heralds and also from London publishers. And here you have an ideas of various examples, various formats and various categories. And this is far from being exhaustive, so you have many other kind of publications for this period. I will consider this first publication of the peerage and the baronetage from a long 18th century perspective. Most historians use later edition of this book, mainly after the critical edition by George Cockayne in the late 19th century. They extract specific information, date of birth or death, number of children, while leaving aside the seemingly useless or fictional material. I'm thinking, for example, of Mark Rothery in his study The Reproductive Behavior of the English Landed Gentry, a study which relies on the 1814 and 1849 Purge edition of Burke. I will try to approach this publication from a different angle, namely to retrace the condition of their production in the 18th century by the London publishers, and to understand the motives which drove an increasing number of families to subscribe to them and even to provide vast amount of records. In doing so, they sent to the publisher thousands of letters. I selected 6 publications which deal with various categories within the English elite. Peerage, both in England and in the Empire, baronetage, and also non-title elite, first labeled by Burke as commoners. And here you have this chart of the families which I picked. So starting with Thomas Wotton, 1727, with 69 families writing to him, up to the project by Burke in 1833 with the peerage and baronetage of the British Empire. So on the whole, you have roughly 1,000 families writing to this publisher. So it's quite a significant sample. This is a material which, to my knowledge, has never been considered. One of the first professional historians, such as the famous Edward Augustus Freeman, referred to this material as, quote, family tales heard from the childhood. And the publisher were merely described as crooks. According to another historian, Horace Round, he noticed that these publishers were not gentlemen and therefore had not, quote, the manly independence to refuse to flatter family pride. So that was really the crux of the matter, was the social status of this London publisher. To see what information we can draw from a letter, I will randomly start with the first correspondence of Wotton, 1727, letter A, Sir Robert Adams from the borough of Wentworth in London, writing to Wotton. He states that he is the only surviving grandson of the first baronet, created in 1660, the 8th and only surviving son of the family. He also stated that he has 2 sons from his second wife, Diana, the elder being born 3 years ago, and he is then mentioned that he is a solicitor from London. It does not even try to suggest a long ancient pedigree, stating simply that the first baronet, a sheriff of London, suffered for the royalist cause during the Civil War. And so he kept various private and public documents related to his grandfather's imprisonment at the Tower of London. It's then mentioned that as his death, his grandfather had grown a bladder weighing 25 ounces. So I had no idea about ounces, so I checked on the internet. That's 700 grams, which apparently is quite big, which is now preserved in a Cambridge laboratory. So from the letter of most correspondence, we have a selected amount of elements. First, we know where they live, where roughly their position in the family is. We could collect some clues about their interest in the publication. In the case of Adams, he just mentioned that unexpectedly he received the title, and he has 2 sons. And also we have some elements on how the family past should be depicted. Here, instead of inventing medieval ancestors, Adams chose the urban setting of London, the Civil War, and scientific anecdote about the body part of his grandfather. So I believe if we combine all these elements in a systematic way, we could gain much insight into the genealogical practices of the English elite on the long 18th century. And today I would like to highlight 3 themes. First, the collaboration between the London publishers, the London and urban elite, and specifically the various editorial tactics used by the former to obtain the trust of the latter. Second, the possibility of building a database on the correspondence using geographical origin, social status, religious, political affiliation, and place in the kinship. And third, last, we have enough detail to develop various case studies from their correspondence by choosing specific families in order to understand how they constructed their ancestral narratives and the consequence of their archival practices on a wider scale. So first, how did the publisher attract the attention of potential customers? How to gain the trust of this family? And I'm going to consider the ways they advertise their ventures, devise the product, format, volumes, price, and also the importance of the political context. Data collected in town directories were obtained on the streets by going door to door, but the gathering of family data on the elite was a less straightforward process. The publishers had to overcome strong suspicions and an avalanche of criticism. And the reason why the visitation of the College of Arms were cancelled in the late 18th century was that many families actually failed to turn up at this visitation. The reason behind this reluctance are open to debate. Some historians consider that they were no longer interested in lineage. But it also could be explained by an opposition to the state meddling in their affair. Many established families thought that the reputation of their name was sufficient and their origin immemorial. They also refused to see their memory transcribed into a directory printed by London publishers from a lower background. So it took a long time and many failures and bankruptcies to turn this publication into profitable businesses. The publishers had to reconcile 2 opposite requirements. First, to make their product accessible and inclusive to a wider urban public, but also to preserve its reputation and to keep the trust of old established families. In 1727, Wotton, the son of a grocer, was still sending printed personal letters to the head of the families. In this slide, briefly, "Sir, you will pardon the freedom of a stranger in addressing you after this manner, but I am going to engrave the arms and print a genealogical account of the families of all the present baronets, I thought it proper to write first to the families in order to have not only a perfect account of them, but also that nothing might be inserted that should be displeasing to them. So it's a kind of veiled threat that if they don't answer, then someone else would do their genealogy. The device was partly successful. Out of the two editions, 150 family got back to him. So around 30% of the living baronets, which is not that bad, but it wasn't sufficient to cover the cost of the operation. For those who refused to answer, Wootton had to rely on antiquarians in each county, for which who serve as intermediaries with the family. In Essex, for example, he gained much information from the non-conformist William Holman, who had an easier access into the London gentry archives. Wootton was very grateful for Holman's help, which even led him to meet in person some Essex baronets in London. In one of his letters of thanks to Holman, he triumphantly noticed, quote, "Sir Roger Martin called lately on me and we drank a bottle together. He's a hearty and merry old gentleman." And then he adds, "You should name what you would have and I would satisfy you." He's then sent Holman an expensive London editions from his shops, namely the Pierre Bell Dictionnaire Philosophique. So the only way he could just make it for Holman's help was to provide him with the latest publication from his shop. In a sense, in this first national crown sourcing, the county sphere remained an obstacle for the London publisher. 60 years later, in the appeal to a larger public, Debrett than Burke were far more successful. Here we have a formula sent by Burke, which is namely a blank application form, asking to add the name, the address to facilitate the work, and even cover the cost of the answer. The table is, quote, "The table is requested to be filled up free of postage." This venture was financed by Henry Colburn, a successful publisher in London, and distributed throughout Britain by various booksellers such as Richard Bentley in England, Bells and Bradford in Edinburgh, and Cumming in Dublin. They were also using advertisement in the Times, the Examiners, and John Bull. So on the peerage and baronetage of the British Empire, the editor attention has been directed to collaterals. He had introduced all those who come within the most remote remainders of family honours. In his 1826 edition, Burke claimed to have registered 100,000 individuals. In other words, it was less a historical book than a dictionary, or rather a directory of the elite. And there was an increasing appetite of many families to be linked to a prestigious name, even if they were far removed from the title order. On the peerage, the advertisement is, in comparison with the tedious and expensive works on the same subject, it is enriched by a variety of personal anecdotes never before published and communicated to the author by the inheritors of the titles. So another selling point, unlike Wootton, Burke provided an opportunity for the respondents to demonstrate their knowledge in history and even to contribute personally to the making of an inclusive narrative around the elite. What matters was less the defense of one's personal pedigree, but rather the display of a historical knowledge. And then on the commoners, this highly influential and extensive class to whom it refers has at present no work of reference. It is an object both for the parties themselves and for all connected with them, with their ties either of alliance, friendship, neighbourhood, patronage or political constituency. So the term of class, of course, is interesting. His book is presented as a tool to navigate in a changing society away from the county community towards a metropolitan social class, which requires some guidelines on how to obtain friendship, alliance, political patronage. With its alphabetical order, Burke made possible cross-referencing throughout the old and new elite. The term class was not yet inimical to the language of lineage. So by appealing to wider public, Burke and Debrett gained many compliments and many complaints. Some customers regretted, quote, that the truth is frequently suppressed out of kindness. Some pedigrees were ridiculed, others complained of unfair treatment. One say too many accounts are derived from maiden, aunts and grandmothers and family followers. Another one, Burke was congratulated by a fellow Irish countryman for, quote, taking the field as the Irish competitors of Debrett. So different reactions, but the Irish element is quite important in Burke's success. Now, if we consider this publication from a material point of view, there were also contradictory expectations. At first, Wotton went for a pocket format, but it was heavily criticized for it. Beckwith complained, I quote, "If you do not print your book in a larger format, that the last one, I think you will have a little sale for it." And his second edition was very much inspired by the format of county history. It has to be expensive, 5 volumes, £3, an octavo, with endless pedigrees, beginning with the founding ancestor in the family line. So very much a luxurious product that a landowner could place in his library on his lower shelves to be seen by the visitors. But then some angry customers complained for the opposite reasons. Sir Mark Pleadell, who has just received the title of baronet, wrote angrily that he should avoid accepting long and dubious pedigree, which are entirely useless. I quote, "If I say that a Johnson was living at Johnson in the reign of Henry I, that Sir William Johnson, created baronet in 1661, was lineally descended from him, this is such an account as cannot be possibly disproved or examined, and therefore can never be believed. Such accounts, I am to think, are satisfactory to nobody." And he goes on to say that the end of publishing genealogies is that the reader may know what family are allied to the party. So Burke and Debrett also stick to an octavo format, which was a middle way between a very expensive quarto realized by William Betham or William Playfair. Playfair was famous for his huge British family antiquity, £90, 9 volumes, and other attempt later on, Hardwick publication, which is very small pocket size, and which is part of the wider collection, including Hardwick's House of Commons, Hardwick's Commercial Directory, and City Guides. But this is much later in the period. So Debrett and Burke's were more expensive, but they find a sort of middle ground between these competing products. So in 1830, there was still the idea that peerage and baronetage should differ from urban directories. Burke, however, because he organized the family according to an alphabetical order, was accused, quote, of displacing families from the order of their various grades, as well as date of creation, to their several ranks. One correspondent felt, quote, that his aristocratical feelings were hurt. That there was something incongruous in mixing up a potent Duke of Devonshire with a baronet physician. So again, it was quite difficult to find the right formula for these publishers. A last part about this question of trust is the question of politics. How to gain trust by appealing to a political agenda. This is a coincidence that between this genealogical publication and there was a coincidence between the genealogical publication and the parliamentary election. And it is not surprising, after each election, there was always an appetite to know more about the new MPs and to obtain some biographical details. But more than only aligning their publication with the parliamentary calendar, some publishers took a further step and took a political stance. Arthur Collins, Wotton's predecessor, for example, and the first publisher of the Peerage, clearly signaled his engagement in favour of the Whig. For the 1727 election, he published a baronage which was dedicated to Robert Walpole. And in his preface, Collins stated that his work was aimed at Bolingbroke's craftsmen, which had linked the corruption of the Whig government to their low birth origin. Collins wanted to demonstrate that the honourable origins of the Walpole deriving, quote, from a brave and worthy stock. He also described the pedigrees of a few Whigs peers who had been decisive in the Glorious Revolution and in the Hanoverian settlement, Churchill, Shaftesbury, and so on. So there was very much a militant piece of work. Wotton, though he has been quite close to Collins, was much cautious and distanced himself from any explicit reference. In his new parentage, which coincided with the 1741 election, he avoided any explicit allusion to the cabinet. After the French Revolution, though, many publications were clearly royalist and Tory. William Betham dedicated his work to the second Marquess of Cornwallis, and in his preface, he expressed a strong warning against the danger of radicalism and saw his publication as a celebration of the military and loyalist values of the elite against, quote, the extravagant demolition of all honours in France. So genealogy was very much used as a weapon against democratic ideas. As for Debrett and Burke, they were clearly closer to the Whig party. John Debrett, of a Huguenot origin, had been a partner of the publisher John Allman, a friend of John Wilkes, and Burke, an Irish Catholic, had a strong progressive agenda in favour of both the Catholic Emancipation of Act of 1829 and the 1832 Reform Act. I have to go quicker. His commoners is dedicated to the Lord Chancellor Baron Brotham, whose action was decisive in the passing of the 1832 Reform Act. Burke saw his commoners as an opportunity to demonstrate, quote, the connection which so intimately exists between the title and the untitled aristocracy. And he provided the Chancellor with an impressive pedigree dating back from the Norman period and linking etymologically Vaux with Beau from Provence and the Principality of Orange. So the Lord Chancellor, through the dynasty of Orange, was linked to the most princely court of the continent and, of course, to the Glorious Revolution. So Burke was repeating what Collins had done a century earlier for Walpole. Of course, some Tory readers cried foul. One parent of Sir Edward Littleton complained that Burke was privileging, quote, the residents of low birth and connection for ideological reasons. He was giving their name, quote, a better repute that belongs to them. He should stop relying on the justice of the peace court rolls, which were full of names of persons non-resident in the counties, containing a number of poor clergymen who resided in manufacturing district, magistrate of no family, and many attorneys inserted as a compliment by the clerk of the peace. So there was a debate about how these parentage were made, and after 1835, a committee of the baronetage was even set up to question the influx of newcomers into the Debrett and Burke publications. The committee claimed to have 1,000 members, but from its archives in Nottingham, it seems that the turnout was actually very low, and its president, Charles Cockrell, had a clear Tory agenda. So to sum up this first part, the publishing business depended on many parameters: marketing, the material aspect, and political, and on the difficult balance between competing expectations between both a meritocratic and an hereditary elite. And it is only with Debret and Burke that this publication achieved an equilibrium. They became profitable and attracted a larger pool of consumers by opening up to the empire and the British eyes. Previously, up to 1800, the main conduit used to circulate family history were periodicals, such as, of course, the Gentleman magazine, which under John Nichols held a dominant position on the market. So second, the idea of a database, constructing a database. I will first talk about the link between social arithmetic and genealogies, proceeding then to consider a short sample of a database as a test case. We know that attempt to understand the social order through numbers became more widespread in the 18th century. That social arithmetics, to use the famous expression by the herald Gregory King in his reflection on the correspondence between status and income. And this calculation fulfill administrative purposes, whether it be fiscal or military. But it also met the wider expectation of the public, this abstract notion which conveyed the idea of a rational and enlightened audience. Retrospectively, genealogical publication had been seen as a mixed bag of fictional stories, but in the 18th century, they were still considered as a tool of knowledge and improvement. And genealogies, as they were linking one generation with another, were establishing a strong sense of causality and determination. So their appeal even expanded to the field of natural science. And last January, I organized a conference on precisely this link between knowledge, enlightenment, and genealogy. And this could be seen, for example, in the structure of the encyclopedia article of D'Alembert and Diderot. Here you see the tree of knowledge, which exactly follow the same patterns of ancient genealogies. Or another example, studied by colleague Olivier Doron, the Histoire naturelle des fraisiers. So here you have a pedigree of strawberries, and the same arguments has been used, the same logic has been used, of course, with dogs and horses in the 18th century. So you have to see not only the family history, but sort of on a wider spectrum. Then, of course, famously in his pamphlet, Playfair on the Advantage of Hereditary Rank and Title in a Free Country, published in 1809, he demonstrated through a complex calculation that in the aristocracy, quote, there are more than 4 times the number of meritorious character than there are amongst men in general. Basically, the naturalization of the social privilege was demonstrated in a scientific manner. And my colleague François-Joseph Deniac has demonstrated how Playfair's passion for pie charts and diagrams was applied in his huge British family antiquity to various categories like the baronetage and the peerage. Further attempts then were made to provide a statistical view of the elite. And I'm working on a William Kingdom chart on the baronetage, which is quite strictly organized by date, number of descendants, age, marital status, origin of the distinction, army, legal, medical, marriage, influence of wealth, which is openly admitted as a key element, and also ancestry. And one can see that many families didn't hide the fact that they were coming from a very short history, 17th century, 18th century. So the issue wasn't exactly to demonstrate a long pedigree, it was just to demonstrate that merit and birth could be linked to each other. Now, of course, as historians, the database we can build from the vast amount of correspondence will fulfill another task. The idea for me is to create a collective portrait of these families by looking for commonalities and differences. And I started working on the smallest sample, that is 150 families who wrote to Wotton for his 2 edition. So I define just to give you an idea of what I'm trying to do. You could see the first mention of Robert Adams, the date of his letter, date of creation of the baronet, is place in the family, cadet, and where he lived. So I did this for 150 family, just to have an idea of who they are and to have a sort of more quantitative approach. And briefly, to go through a few factors, it seems that age is not a significant factor. If I use only the criteria of age, we could see that they're quite well distributed between 18 years old. You have many students who are doing the genealogy for their parents, and up to 80 years old, very ancient correspondence. It's quite difficult to read sometimes. What is noticeable, however, is the criteria of the baronets. It is quite striking that Restoration baronet, that is created during the reign of Charles II, represent around 40% of my sample, which is as much as the one created during the reign of Anne and George, which at first I found it surprising, because I would have thought that recent baronets would be very happy and would rush to have their pedigree printed in a national directory, and there are some of them. And of course, they often require Wotton's assistance. For example, there is the case of the first baronet, Henry Gush, MP and East India merchant, who wrote to Wotton admitting, quote, that he is entirely unacquainted with his pedigree. Another one, Adolphus Wotton, aide-de-camp to the Duke of Marlborough and promoted baronet in 1718, wrote, I am so little skilled in genealogical affairs, and therefore he asked Wotton to sort of find some biscuits, some elements about his family. And he trusts Wotton that he will methodize in the manner more suitable to your design. But the logic behind the strong mobilization of the Restoration baronet is quite different. Considering the high mortality rate of the year 1680-1720, most of the correspondents were not from a direct lineage. And here you have so the proportion, much higher proportion of cadets who pay much more attention to the alliances and the female lines. So we still came across a few caricatural vertical tree. This one of men wearing. So there is just the first ancestor, then there is series of male with nothing else, and then suddenly at the 27 he start talking about himself. So you come across a few of these trees, but they are less common. No, the rule seems to be increasingly. Here's the case of the bridgeman, a much horizontal perspective. Here, John Bridgeman belonged to the second line, which inherited the title after the death of the first line here, represented on the right. And he gave a very detailed description of his brothers and sisters with all the alliances they made. So the idea here is different. It's less about talking about a long ancient history. It's more sort of talking about the immediate ancestor of the family. And we've seen that most of them were talking actually about their grandfathers and the Civil War and the Restoration. So as far as the local origin are concerned, it is also noticeable that the vast majority came from royalist areas of Yorkshire, the borders, Lancashire, Oxfordshire, and also part are coming from home counties, Kent and Essex. And I would venture to suggest that what trigger for those families coming from the west, from the north, their interest in Wotton's project is mostly to declare their fidelity to their family past, the 17th century family past, and to their role during the Stuarts. And if one look more closely into the history, it appears that most of these families from these areas are Catholic, Tories, and some Jacobites, such as the Armitage, Barlow, Blackett, Blount, Bradshaw, Charlton. And I've also looked at the sort of political engagement of those families. There are 33 who have a seat in the Commons, and the balance is sort of more equal. Only 15 were clearly on the Tory side. So you have, while the balance between MPs are sort of equal between Whig and Tories, if you see the families, those who have no parliamentary seat, they are clearly on the Tory and even the Jacobite side. Of course, the agenda is not mentioned in the pedigree, but the reference to the Civil War was an effective and indirect way to stand one's ground without being explicitly subversive. One could also see the importance of the neighborhood with letters coming from the same local area, thus displaying some collaboration prior to the individual's writing. And clearly, I've been working on the Oxford Lieutenancy of North Riding with families from Kilnwick, Aldbrough, Bramston, Paddington, writing exactly at the same time to Wotton to provide some similar narrative about their family in the area. And it is very likely that they were discussing this project during balls, essays, or through letters. So a quantitative approach helps us to see beyond the original initiative and to see the existence of communities linked by a common memory and engagement. They were also reacting to the domination of the Whig interpretation of the 17th century, which has been well illustrated in the case of Arthur Collins' publication, which I mentioned earlier. So in many cases, this seems to be a way to vindicate a past as well as a social status. Similar works on later publication will help us to distinguish other types of communities of memory. I'm thinking about the families of Republicans who in the late 18th century start defending their Cromwellian engagement, or later the dozens of Irish families who wrote to Burke in the 1820s to talk about their suffering in Ireland, or also the many families who are eager to celebrate their engagement in the Revolutionary and the Napoleon War in Europe and India. So statistical approaches are useful insofar as they provide us with some general directions by revealing patterns which do not appear on the scale of one case study. However, these dry criteria should be supplemented with a more qualitative approach and more detailed case studies, and this will be my last part. So from a first reading of this correspondence, I would like to draw out three main questions. First, the conflict within the kinship. We have any example of this. Second, the way family engage with the archives. How clearly, in a very pragmatic manners, they select their papers and how they just get involved into the making of a discourse. And lastly, we'll see that from the point of view of the publishers, their wish to please their customer do not exclude some critical ideas about this privileged class. So first, it is worth stressing that many correspondents alluded to judicial procedures in the Court of Chancery, and notably around the question of illegitimate children. And examples are very numerous in these letters. Just one example, Debrett received threatening letters for having inserted the name of the younger brother of Lord Kirkcudbright, whom the letter considered to be a bastard. I quote, "You ought to know that bastards have no right to appear under the name of any nobleman in his pedigree, nor shall they under my name, as long as the honours of the family are in my keeping. So, sir, I now warn you for a second and last time to expurge the publication of this lying statement, a libel on my name for which offence you will be answerable to me." And so actually Debrett will be sued by this angry elder brother. The need to be seen in this publication is also linked to a desire to strengthen the identity in a mundane and even sometimes legal context. There was a strong competition among many and remote collaterals to defend their right to a prestigious surname. And it's, instead of becoming marginalized by the growth of the middle sort, the professionals, surname of baronets or peerage gained a higher symbolical value. Names were then traded from one family to another and to provide the illusion of a historical continuity. So more than place, in a sense, increasingly a prestigious surname was a key element in the cultural capital. For example, Aubry Ant, married to a De Vere, asked Debret not to mention his name Ant. For, I quote, "In society, I have long dropped the name of Ant, but always use it as a matter of business." So he was using two names depending on the context, whether mundane or professional. One Kennel is convinced, for example, that the respectability and the perfection of his connection to the Montmorency would be sufficient, quote, to be quoted for authority in any court of law and justice in the British Dominion. And there are many examples of similar expectation. And I would just mention the interesting case of Julia Elizabeth Brown in Debret's peerage. Julia's father, the Reverend Thomas James Twilterton, chaplain to the government in Ceylon, has just died in 1824 in Colombo. He has divorced from her mother in 1798 and later remarried within the prestigious Ashe family. Julia and her son were not recognized as legitimate by the siblings of the second marriage, and they forbade her to be called Twistleton, and even to appear next to them in any printed pedigree. They explained to the publisher that the divorce happened because of the dissolute lives of Julia's mothers in the colonies, and that their father was convinced that Julia was born out of wedlock. The divorce and the following conflicts are mentioned in various sources, the House of Commons, Parliamentary paper, and even the Gentleman's Magazine. But from a few letters in Debret's collection, one can construct a more documented example of a family conflict. Apart from appealing to the editor of the peerage, Julia collected various letters of support from former servants of the clergyman, from her maternal grandmother, from a former colleague of her father, and even from the late George Vansittart, MP for Berkshire. But the main reason behind this mobilization and her insistence of being called Twistleton is that, apart from the defense of her honor, pragmatic motives were at stake. Julia would like her son to be accepted free of charge to the Winchester School and then to obtain easier access to New College, Oxford, a privilege which was then reserved to the descendant of the Twistleton family. So the intervention of the families to shape their tree in a more horizontal or vertical form is, and this is my second part, linked to a wider theme, which is namely the ability of the correspondent to compose a narrative from different sources and to make them credible. This transaction generated a huge collection of historical sources, mixing oral testimonies, my grand-aunt say such and such, extracts draw from local and national histories, of course, William Camden is amply quoted, Clarendon, Hume, even some textbook like Peter Ellin, Help to English History is often mentioned. And many correspondents were also assisted by a younger brother, either in the clergy or acting as a recorder in the local archives. I think the role of the recorders here is very important. And just briefly from the picture, just to you could see that in their letters they're pasting things, they're writing in different orders, so it's a sort of avalanche of writing that we have to deal with. So an intense activity. And from 1820 onwards, there was even a literary agency office in London who proposed to assist any gentleman, quote, to be furnished with abstract or copies or rare manuscript or any work or records. For the sum, for example, if you want a copy in the British Museum, it would cost you £5, which is quite a lot. So the aim were either most commonly to retrace their ancestry as far as possible, or to testify to the family presence at a decisive moment. It could be the 100 Years' War, the battles of Naseby or Blenheim, and to do so, many families refer to certain objects in their possession: a Bible, a window pane, some weapon, a glass, once allegedly by a king, a precious ring, a book plate. Here you have, so many sort of elements used by the family, and also the idea would be to shape an aristocratic past, pastoral and oblivious to many changes in the family business. Manufacturing, slave trade, mining, nothing of that sort will be, of course, present in this narrative. For example, in Wotton's correspondence, Orwell's mostly failed to mention his essential commitment in the Manchester trade. Similarly, William Freke asked him to scrap his Irish settlement and to better expand on his Hampshire origins. Meanwhile, James Lowther, the richest commoner of the realm, avoided any reference to his Whitehaven coal mines. And the same pattern could be seen a century later. Claude Bering from Devon asked Debrett to delete the expression banker of London. Another one, Charles Lennox, required that any reference, quote, relating to the mining concern in the county should be omitted as having nothing to do with the family history. So these alterations could be observed even through several generations, and this is the interest of having a sort of long perspective. I'm giving you the example of the Blackett, who writing to Wotton and Debrett, and just to compare the letters. Lead merchants from Newcastle, they bought an estate in 1690. In 1725, Edwards, the third baronet, a captain in the navy, insisted on his grandfather's deed during the Civil War. So clearly there's Catholic elements here there. Then Edwards, his nephew, the fourth baronet, in 1740, always to Wotton, laid the stress on the charitable actions of the first and second baronet. So he scrapped the element about the Civil War, and mentioned their refusal to save William III. In 1825, Edwards, always Edwards, the fifth baronet, this time preferred to refer to their presence as Agincourt, quoting a county history of Northumberland. So each generation has got his own narrative, which suit them. Many former merchants and lawyers were indeed happy to trade their urban past in exchange for a gentry pedigree, but it wasn't systematic, as we have seen in the chart of kingdom. Many were also happy to just mention a very modest background. And far from being restricted to declining county elite, I believe that the making of this publication helped to make sense of the strong social changes in the 18th century. I also believe that the family inquiries triggered by the London publisher had a wider impact on the archival practices in Britain. The interest was felt throughout the elite up to the Parliament, who, as you know, had several records commissioned from 1800 to 1838. Many families did not see their archives as only relevant to their private sphere. They saw them as a national patrimony in the parishes, in the counties, and the national London repository. One familiar contributor to Burke, Thomas Phillips, wrote, for example, to the Secretary of State, John Russell, about, quote, the importance of preserving records of all ancient noble families, and stressed the determination to save the only memorials of their ancestor from total destruction. Someday, a mad fit will seize the populace of London, like that of Bristol, when all the depots of records will be set fire to. So there is clearly, From this last example, the fact that genealogical activities are not only a peaceful hobby from an old antiquarian, but also the result of competing interests and violent emotions, well, not always, but I mean emotions, both within and outside the family. And moving on to the third and last question, it is often the case that the creation of genealogies, however flattery they might be, led to the accumulation of rumors and gossips, which are often set aside and preserved by the publishers. While updating the latest birth and death of his baronets on the margins of his own 1741 edition, Wotton, for example, demonstrates a significant appetite for all the suicides, jail sentences, and miserable death of his customers. He gathered, for example, a substantial documentation around the case of Aubry, the Aubry family, from 1720 up to 1740. Letters, bits of papers from the almanacs and the judiciary chronicles. So we know from Wotton's scribblings that the elder son of the third baronet got a servant pregnant, killed her and the baby, and then hid the corpse in a wood near the property. A dog from the local husbandman dug the baby out. So these professional publishers were truly fascinated by the world of their customers, and not always in a good way. It would be hard to explain why they were hungry collectors of city affairs. And again, as for the family, I believe that it would be misleading to see this publisher being immune from passions and resentment towards their superiors. Wotton did nothing with these black genealogies he accumulated, but we know that other radical figures did. And I just mentioned the work by Linda Colley on Thomas Holdfield or John Wade and his Black Book of Corruption Unmasked, in which Wade demonstrated that the length of the lineage could become the consequence of a deeply entrenched corruption. So, to conclude, I believe that the abundant correspondence could help us to better understand the various rationale behind genealogical practices and to see more clearly what amateurs were doing with their archives, how they were using them and selecting them to produce a temporary image of themselves. These documents should be studied with the tools and ideas provided by a rich 18th century historiography around social status, language and consumption. And I do believe that these countless family stories had generated a long-term aristocratic ideology, to which the old and the new elites have contributed to. It is striking to see actually owners of county estate nowadays using these stories, recycling these stories on their webpage to attract some visitors, or to reflect upon the remarkable ability of generations of publishers in adapting their products to a changing market. We know that the firms Dibret and Burke have survived up to now without any difficulties. And recently, Airbnb, the home sharing site, decided to team up with Dibret on an etiquette guide to instruct guests and hosts on appropriate manners. Both Dibret and Burke are also providing advice to rich foreign newcomers settling down in London. Their remarkable survival is also symptomatic of the perennial debate about birth and merit. As J. Smith has demonstrated for the 18th century French nobility, their legitimacy was never based solely on their pedigree. Part of the Enlightenment was precisely to discuss the link between inherited disposition and individual skills. And by the same token, the so-called 18th century British modernity was still very much haunted by the ancestors' voices. It is hard not to agree with Stéphane Coligny when he argues, quote, that birth is the 18th century principle, office the 19th century, achievement the 20th century, and celebrity the 21st century. However, as with so much else in British history, the earlier stage have not been wholly superseded by the latest one, but have all continued to exist along them. The latest publication of Debret in 2015 on the 500 most influential people brings about opposite and predictable reaction from the Times and the Guardian. While the former sees it as celebrating a society of talent, quote, of role models and heroes, the latter was pointing out that among these 500 individuals, more than 40% went to fee-paying schools, confirming a lack of diversity and showing trend of Britain becoming less meritocratic. Thank you very much.